Hello, and welcome back to The Savvy Psychologist. I'm Dr. Ellen Hendrickson, and every week I'll help you meet life's challenges with evidence-based research, a sympathetic ear, and zero judgment. Slights with a smile. Silence when you know they can hear you. Compliments with a side of side-eye. Passive-aggressive people know how to serve up a veritable buffet of "oh no, she didn't," and tacking on LOL afterwards doesn't negate things. So, if you are tired of being on the receiving end of insults followed with JK, or sick of finding ostensibly polite but obviously angry notes from your roommate, today's episode is for you. By request from Steve in Boston, here are 5 ways to deal with the passive-aggressive people in your life. Because, after all, we're not passive-aggressive, unlike some people we know. However it manifests, passive aggression is the fine art of being angry without seeming angry. And there are 2 ingredients, anger and avoidance. So the first, anger, or its cousin's annoyance, frustration, or irritation, always bubbles beneath the surface. But trying to suppress anger is like trying to keep a lid on a pot of boiling water. Eventually, it will spew out like a steam vent. Now, in addition to thinly veiled anger, the second ingredient in passive aggression is avoidance. It's a way to avoid conflict, avoid feeling genuine anger, and avoid having to be direct in a situation where one feels incapable. So, individuals who are passive-aggressive have learned somewhere along the way that it's not okay to be angry. Maybe they were taught that conflict is so threatening it has to be avoided at all costs. Maybe they were taught that being nice is the only option. Or maybe it's their way of expressing their dissatisfaction without outright rebellion. So, what to do when your partner insists through clenched teeth, "I'm not mad," or your teenager says with an eye roll, "Geez, you didn't tell me you wanted me to do my laundry today," or your roommate spells out, "I unclogged the drain" in bathtub hair that looks suspiciously like yours. Well, here are 5 tips to try. Tip number 1 is look for a pattern. We are all human, and we all have our days. So sometimes a comment or an eye roll will leak out, like a spurt from that steam vent. But if it's a pattern or a default when things get stressful, passive aggression needs to be dealt with. But dealing with it is precisely what the passive-aggressive person is trying to avoid. Passive-aggressive people avoid conflict like the plague. They're too scared, or they just don't know how to handle conflict, so they avoid it. But then resentment builds, and their hostility leaks more than a porcupine's raincoat. Which brings us to tip number 2. Make it clear that it's safe to talk it out. Passive-aggressive people are afraid you'll yell at them, reject them, stop loving them, or otherwise react in a much stronger manner than you actually will. And it's particularly important to call out passive-aggressive behavior at work. Passive-aggressive colleagues are often unhappy or insecure in their jobs. But rather than raising the issue, passive-aggressive coworkers create obstacles, waste time, and generally make everyone's job more difficult, not to mention less pleasant. Therefore, whether at work or at home, make it clear you would rather hear about problems than leave them roiling under wraps. Critically, reinforce this by not reacting with the very thing they're afraid of. If you blow your top, belittle them, or otherwise silence their anger, they'll go right back to letting it bubble under the surface. They'll go right back into their shell, like a hermit crab, with only the claws hanging out. Now, if you try to make it safe and talk it out, but they still deny anger or dissatisfaction, like, "Me? I'm fine. Everything's fine." Or, "Sorry I was late, but you should have sent me a reminder email," things suddenly go to a whole different level. So now, let's get back into tip number 3. For incurable cases, validate them. Sometimes passive aggression is so ingrained it becomes a default way to deal with the world. For chronically passive-aggressive individuals, in addition to avoiding anger, they also avoid responsibility. Passive-aggressive people do this to avoid being exposed as a failure. After all, if the dog eats their homework, you can't give them an F on it. Or to avoid a job they think they're too good for. Who does dad think he is telling me to mow the lawn? However it manifests, the passive-aggressive person acts defensive. They make themselves the victim. And this puts you in a difficult place because no matter how you present it, they'll see your attempt to communicate and raise you a deflection and an excuse. What? I unloaded the dishwasher just like you asked. You didn't tell me I had to put the dishes in the cabinet. Therefore, start with empathy. Acknowledge their excuse, even if you're rolling your eyes internally. Why? Well, it is vital to align yourself with them because working against them is slippery at best, antagonistic at worst. It'll reinforce their idea of themselves as a victim. So, say things like, I hear you. That sounds hard. I understand. I get it. Make it clear that you're working together as a team. But then, tip number 4, hold them to their responsibilities. People who are passive-aggressive do it precisely because they get away with it. If they get a free pass because the dog ate their homework, you can bet they'll be dipping tonight's homework in gravy and making it happen again. So, acknowledge their situation, empathize and align yourself with them, but then hold them to their responsibilities, even if, especially if, it would be easier to bail them out or do their job yourself. So, for example, the dog ate your homework. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That happened to me a few times and it stinks. So here's another copy and you can hand it in tomorrow along with tonight's homework. So in a nutshell, there's acknowledgement and sympathy for their victimhood, but the standards don't change. And it is worth the inconvenience on your part to nip it in the bud. So for instance, I understand you didn't go to the grocery store because you couldn't remember what I asked you to pick up. But I still need onions and lemons to make dinner, so thank you so much for going now. And finally, tip number 5. Reward them when they're properly assertive. So, if the chronically late passive-aggressive person does show up on time, express genuine pleasure that they're present. Not with a sarcastic, nice to see you on time for once, but with a big smile and a seat at the table. Likewise, if someone who usually procrastinates completes a task on time, give them the praise they secretly want. Hey, you're here right on the dot. I really appreciate that. After all, passive-aggressive people, as aggravating as they are just like everybody else at heart. They want love and approval. And while they sure make it hard to get past their prickles, with some strategic moves, you can help them behave better around you, which is totally worth missing out on future hilariously passive-aggressive notes left in the office fridge. As always, thank you so much for making The Savvy Psychologist a part of your life. Never miss an episode when you sign up for the newsletter at quickanddirtytips.com/newsletters or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. You can like on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at QDT Savvy Psych, or follow me at Ellen Hendrickson. And check out ellenhendrickson.com for free, helpful resources to beat social anxiety and be your true self. As always, The Savvy Psychologist is strictly for informational purposes and doesn't substitute for mental health care from a licensed professional. Have a wonderful week. I'll see you next Friday for a happier, healthier mind.